Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today, the Ghana Statistical Service presents the Consumer Price Index and inflation figures for February 2026. Let me begin with the headline numbers. In February 2026, Ghana's year-on-year inflation rate was 3.3%. Year-on-year inflation simply means how much prices have changed compared to the same month the previous year. So, on average, prices in February 2026 were 3.3% higher than they were in February 2025. This represents a 0.5 percentage point decline from 3.8% in January 2026 and a 19.8 percentage point drop from the 23.1% recorded in February 2025. In fact, this is the 14th consecutive month of decline and the lowest rate recorded since the rebasing of CPI in 2021. On a month-on-month basis, inflation was 0.8%. Month-on-month inflation tells us how prices changed between January and February 2026. In simple terms, prices increased by less than 1% in 1 month. Now let's break this down. Food inflation slowed to 2.4% in February 2026, down from 3.9% in January 2026. On a monthly basis, food prices increased by 0.2% between January and February 2026. This easing in food inflation is important because food constitutes a large weight in the CPI basket and directly affects household budgets. Non-food inflation, however, rose to 4.0% in February 2026, up from 3.8% in January 2026. Month-on-month, non-food prices increased by 1.2%. So while food price pressures eased, non-food price pressures heightened moderately. When we look at goods versus services, inflation for goods slowed to 3.2% in February 2026 from 3.7% in January 2026. Goods make up nearly 3/4 of the CPI basket, so this slowdown provides relief where it matters most. Services inflation also eased to 3.7% from 4.2% in January 2026. Looking at the origin of products, inflation for locally produced items fell marginally to 4.5% from 4.6% in January 2026, while inflation for imported items declined from 2.0% in January 2026 to 0.6% in February 2026. This suggests that exchange rate stability and global price conditions are helping moderate imported inflation. Now to the regions. Inflation remains uneven across the country. The Northeast region recorded the highest year-on-year inflation at 8.9%, while the Savannah region recorded negative inflation of 5.6%. This means that whilst prices increased on the average by 8.9% in the Northeast region, prices declined by 5.6% in the Savannah region. On a month-on-month basis, Greater Accra recorded the highest increase in prices at 2.4% in February 2026, while Western region recorded the lowest at negative 2.7%. These differences reflect variations in local supply conditions, transport costs, and market access. In terms of price drivers, the top 5 contributors to inflation at the item level are charcoal, green plantain, cinema or cultural services, public and private secondary school fees, and here I'm talking about at the SSS level, and river fish, which altogether contributed 55.5% to the overall year-on-year inflation of 3.3%. The top 5 highest inflation items, that is, the top 5 items which saw the highest year-on-year price increases in February 2026 are green plantain, which recorded an inflation rate of 67.9%, ginger at 59.1%, shrimps at 58.1%, charcoal at 53.1%, and crab at 46.9%. These items altogether contributed 37.4% to overall inflation in February 2026. At the same time, several items recorded very low or negative inflation, helping to offset overall price pressures. The bottom 5 lowest inflation items in February 2026 are garden eggs, which recorded an inflation rate of negative 58.7%, or a price decline of 58.7% between February 2026 and February 2025, pawpaw at negative 49.3%, fried fish at negative 49.2%, cocoyam leaves or contomere at negative 47.3%, and fresh okra at negative 42.4%. These items altogether dragged inflation down by 17.3% in February 2026. What this really means is that inflation today is being driven by a smaller number of items than broad-based price increases across the entire economy. So, what should we take away? First, inflation has fallen significantly and consistently over the past year. This signals improving macroeconomic stability. Second, food inflation has eased considerably, which is positive for households. Third, regional disparities remain and require targeted interventions. For government, the priority is clear. Continue to maintain fiscal discipline, stabilize food supply chains, and invest in storage, irrigation, transport, and market access to reduce regional gaps. For businesses, this is the time to improve efficiency, strengthen local supply sourcing, and pass on cost savings to consumers. For households, with inflation easing, there is greater room to plan. Track spending carefully, avoid unnecessary expenses, and build small savings buffers whenever possible. Let me end by expressing our sincere appreciation to market women and men who provide the data, the media, and our dedicated staff at the Ghana Statistical Service. Your cooperation and professionalism make this work possible. At the Ghana Statistical Service, we remain firmly committed to delivering timely, accurate, relevant, and credible statistics to support evidence-based decision-making and national development. Thank you very much.